We're in Egypt, and we're headed up first to Alexandria. Now, Alexandria, of course, is named after Alexander the Great, who had the city laid out. After that, he went off to war to defeat the Persians. Incidentally, that picture of him that's so famous, his head is cocked a little bit, and it's thought that maybe he was deaf in one ear, and that's why his head is cocked that way. In any event, after a number of battles and wars throughout Asia, he comes back to Babylon, and he dies there at a very young age. His body is eventually transported back to Egypt. But that's a very interesting and complicated story all by itself.
This is the story behind Alexander's body and his tomb. Almost immediately after Alexander's death, chaos erupted, as the Macedonians quickly began arguing over the fate of the empire, leaving his body unattended for many days in the Babylonian heat. Legend has it that upon returning to the corpse, to everyone's amazement, they found it in pristine condition, untouched by decay. Perdiccas, the highest-ranking commander in Babylon, then had Alexander's body embalmed and placed in a golden coffin. For the next 2 years, Alexander's body remained in Babylon, as Perdiccas and his followers oversaw the construction of a funeral carriage unlike any other the world had seen. The carriage was designed to resemble a great temple. It had beautiful Ionic columns, encircled by paintings depicting Alexander and his army, and was covered with gold. It was to be pulled by 64 mules, each bearing a golden crown and bell. Upon its completion, Perdiccas ordered that Alexander's body was to be escorted home to Aigai in Macedonia, the traditional resting place of the Macedonian kings. Yet the plan went horribly wrong. The governor of Egypt, Ptolemy, was aware of the great wealth and potential of his domain, and soon grew ambitious, eager to get rid of Perdiccas' control. He believed he might achieve this by taking possession of Alexander's body, as it was a superhuman talisman representing authority and legitimacy in this new post-Alexander world. Whoever controlled the body held great sway. Ptolemy was not deterred by Perdiccas's precautions to keep the body, but he needed a daring plan. In 321 BC, Alexander's elaborate funeral cart left Babylon for Macedonia. Yet as the procession was making its way through Syria, Ptolemy made his move, bribing the escort, seizing the body, and diverting it to Egypt, where he had it housed in Memphis, the traditional Egyptian capital. Perdiccas was furious, as his authority as regent had been severely tarnished. It was the opposite for Ptolemy, as Alexander's soldiers came from far and wide to swell the ranks of his army. Perdiccas immediately marched on Egypt with his army, his main aim to regain control of the body and restore his authority. Ptolemy emerged victorious, and Perdiccas was murdered. Alexander's body was now securely in Ptolemy's possession. He quickly began proclaiming the link between himself and Alexander, becoming the first of the Diadochi to put Alexander's image on his coinage, and emphasizing that he was a favorite of Alexander in his account of the conquest of Asia. Ptolemy also cultivated a local legend of Alexander. Rather than being the son of Philip of Macedon, Egyptian tales soon became widespread that Alexander was the son of the last Egyptian pharaoh, Nectanebo II. In 343 BC, the Persians had deposed Nectanebo, who had then died in exile. His pre-made sarcophagus in Memphis had therefore remained empty. It is likely Ptolemy had first placed Alexander in this empty coffin, and it was from there that this fabulous story took root. A pharaoh of Egypt could only be legitimate if he was related to his predecessor, so this tale helped portray Alexander as Nectanebo's rightful heir. It also established a connection between the Macedonian and Egyptian dynasties, a connection that only helped Ptolemy's cause. At the same time, Ptolemy began spreading the rumour that he was in fact an illegitimate son of Philip II, and thus the half-brother of Alexander. Both stories spread rapidly and helped Ptolemy secure his rule in Egypt, thanks in good measure to his clever use of Alexander's body. Following the climactic Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC, Ptolemy had Alexander's body moved to the centre of his new capital at Alexandria and placed in a new elaborate tomb. The city had been founded by Alexander back in 331 BC, but had only recently been completed. Desiring to further emphasize this link, Ptolemy IV Philopator placed Alexander's body in a new royal burial complex in circa 215 BC. It soon became known as the Soma, or the body, named after its main exhibit. This new mausoleum was almost certainly visually majestic, perhaps inspired by the famed tomb of Mausolus at Halicarnassus. The complex may also have been circular, in its turn possibly inspiring the great tombs of the Roman emperors Augustus and Hadrian. Inside the enclosure, Alexander's body was placed in an underground chamber along with remains of the Ptolemies, once again emphasizing the closest possible link between the Ptolemies and Alexander. The Soma soon became an iconic feature of Alexandria. From far and wide, visitors would journey to Alexander's city and see his marvelous tomb. It was a place of pagan pilgrimage.
So how was it that Alexander the Great died at such a young age? Well, nobody knows for sure, but there is an interesting story that he and his friends were out riding one day, and a flock of birds flew over, and in mid-flight they all fell to the earth, dead. Now Alexander the Great was intellectually curious, so he went over to examine the birds, and he may have died, or at least gotten sick, as a result of bird flu. But it is possible that Alexander didn't die from the bird flu. Maybe he just got sick. Now, his doctors were treating him with some medicine called hellebore. All hellebore plants are toxic. Hellebore poisoning is rare, but it does occur. Hellebore plants are usually left alone by animals such as deer and rabbits due to the fact that the leaves of the plant produce poisonous alkaloids, making them distasteful to the animals. It was first used in the First Sacred War at the start of the 6th century BC to poison the water supply of the city of Kira, a Greek city. The Greeks were always embarrassed by this use of poison to win a war. They always believed that you should face your enemy with a spear or a sword at close range and kill them that way. In any event, the use of hellebore at Kira may be part of the reason why we have rules against poison gas and other biological agents. Poisonings occur through ingestion or handling. The hellebore plant should not be ingested because poisoning cases are most severe. This is especially true when the hellebore are eaten in large quantities. Symptoms of ingestion include burning of the mouth and throat, salivation, vomiting, abdominal cramping, diarrhea, and nervous symptoms of various kinds. It's believed that hellebore was used, however, by Hippocrates. Despite its toxicity, hellebore was generally used by Greek and Roman doctors to treat paralysis, gout, and other diseases, and more particularly insanity. But even accidental over medication with hellebore may not have actually killed Alexander the Great. You remember that story that after Alexander died, they left his body out in the sun for days, and when they came back, everybody was really surprised that his body was uncorrupted. Well, of course, at that time, the belief was that that was because he was a god. But that may not necessarily be the reason. It's entirely possible that he was in a coma for a fairly long period of time, such that he appeared to be dead. But back to our story.
Now, after the Ptolemies had control of Alexander's body and they had buried him in Nectanebo II's crypt in Memphis, that was the last legitimate Egyptian pharaoh of the line. After his period, the Persians took over, and then, of course, when Alexander kicked the Persians out, he takes over as pharaoh. Well, the Ptolemies were very keen to associate that last native ruler with Alexander, and so they let rumors get about that Philip of Macedon wasn't really his father. It was this Egyptian pharaoh that was actually his father. And they put him in the crypt for Nectanebo because Nectanebo had never used it. He died outside the country.
That brings us to Alexander's first stop at Sahara, which is the cemetery just beside the city of Memphis, which at one time was the capital of Egypt. Sahara, incidentally, is where the step pyramid, the first pyramid, was built. You'll recall that Alexander the Great was at first put in the Serapeum at Sahara. It's an underground complex of tunnels. The tunnels actually go on for miles. This is also one of the places where the mummified bulls were kept in tombs, just as though they were pharaohs or something. And of course, those tombs are extremely large. After all, they were bulls that were being mummified. From here, Alexander's body was eventually moved to Alexandria.
We're in Alexandria at Pompey's Pillar. That's Pompey's Pillar behind me. Actually, it has nothing to do with Pompey. A more correct term for this particular area is the Serapeum, We've talked about serapeums before, and this particular serapeum probably was a resting place for Alexander for a while. He was initially at the serapeum in the Memphis area, brought up to Alexandria, probably put in this serapeum, and then after that moved to the more permanent location on Soma.
By the way, we'll be talking about the Library of Alexandria later, but when the Library of Alexandria disintegrates, as it does eventually, the collection of books on the inside were distributed to various locations in Alexandria, and the Serapeum was one of the subsidiary libraries that developed. Now we know where the Serapeum is and was on both the old maps of Alexandria and the modern maps. The streets have changed a little bit, but not a great deal. And we also know roughly where Alexander's tomb was supposed to be in Alexandria. So now it's just a matter of comparing the old street map with the new street map in order to figure out where Alexander's body was likely to have been. That in black is the original street plan. That in red is a more modern street plan. Alexander's tomb should be someplace between the gate of the moon here and the gate of the sun.
And that location is probably on a road which at that time was called Soma, which means body. Now we're not sure where on the road he might have been entombed. There's several possibilities. The odds-on favorite is that he was entombed in what is now a mosque, the Nabi Daniel Mosque.
This is a modern street map, and the Daniel Mosque, and that is Daniel from Daniel the Lion's Den, is located near the bottom of this map. Look for the blue arrow. We also know that it was somewhat close to the old Roman theater, and we know where the Roman theater is because it's been excavated. See the red arrow.
There is a possibility that that's true. In 1850, an archaeologist proposed that it was, but that area has never been excavated and may never be excavated.
This is the old Daniel Mosque. It's said to contain the body of the prophet Daniel, which is, of course, quite impossible because Daniel lived centuries before this place was built. Nevertheless, they really surprised me when they allowed us to go into the mosque, film in the mosque, and to go down into the crypt. This is said to be Daniel's tomb, but who knows who's actually buried here? But there is something very interesting. There's a tunnel behind me, and that tunnel is being excavated. It leads from the mosque out towards the street that I think is Soma Street. And if that's the case, and if this is the location for Alexander's body, all of the Ptolemies ought to be here, including Cleopatra. If this is the location, it means, among other things, that Julius Caesar was here in 48 BC paying his respects. It also means that this is the location where Queen Cleopatra took gold from the tomb to finance her war against the Roman Emperor Octavian. or at least he later became the Roman emperor. Following Cleopatra's death, Augustus visited Alexander's burial place in Alexandria, and he was said to have placed flowers on the tomb and a golden diadem on the general's head. There's also an interesting little anecdote about that visit. When Augustus was visiting Alexander's tomb, he was asked if he'd like to see the Ptolemies, and he said, "I came to see a king, not a row of corpses." Other sources say that Caligula visited the tomb of Alexander and took his breastplate, and in 199 AD, Septimius Servus visited the tomb in Alexandria and ordered it be sealed in order to stop ongoing looting. In 215 AD, items from Alexander's tomb were relocated by Caracalla, who removed Alexander's tunic, his ring, and his belt, and some other items, and deposited them on the coffin. In 356, the city was inundated by a series of earthquakes and rising sea levels, and the waters of the Nile Delta caused Alexandria to sink as much as 12 feet since Alexander's time.
There is another possibility of another building on that same road, and that is St. Mark's Cathedral. Now, St. Mark's Cathedral is very interesting for a bunch of different reasons. One of which is it's the seat of the Coptic Patriarch, that is the Christian head of the Egyptian Church. Just like the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church and the Greek Patriarch is the head of the Orthodox Church, this particular person was a co-equal individual. At about the same time that there's a crypt laid aside for St. Mark, who is said to have founded the church, Alexander's body goes missing. So the theory is that the body that was in that church was actually the body of Alexander and not St. Mark. And that would have been at about 329 or so. Now, a few hundred years later, 828 I think, some Venetians came to Alexandria and they stole the body of St. Mark, which may have been Alexander, and they took it back to St. Mark's Cathedral. So if you want to see Alexander the Great's body, it's entirely possible you could do that in Venice, Italy.
St. Mark's Cathedral is just down the street from the Nabi Daniel Mosque.
دي المنشية ولا محطة الرمل؟ دي المنشية. ازاي يا عم؟ هو الواد اللي وصف لنا قال لنا فين؟ هي في واحدة هنا بقى. هي دي. لسه هتلف كده وترجع عليها وتلف تاني. المهم نوصل. بس هي بتطلع هي بس. ما عارفها.
I'm in Alexandria, and behind me is St. Mark's. Now, St. Mark's is just down the street from the mosque that you just saw. And it is the alternate place where it is likely that Alexander the Great may have been entombed.
St. Mark's has been the seat of the Coptic Church, the Egyptian Christian Church, for a very long time. And this is a list inside the church of the patriarchs that are buried in the crypt there. And of course, the oldest patriarch is Saint Mark, the gospel writer. Now, when the Venetian merchants stole the body of Saint Mark, according to the church here, they didn't quite get all of him. Specifically, they didn't get the skull. And so the church says that they still have the skull and always have. And then a few years ago, St. Mark's in Venice sent part of the body back to St. Mark's Cathedral in Alexandria for their reliquaries. This crypt down in the bottom of the basement of the church is said to be the resting place for not only St. Mark's skull, but all the other patriarchs of the Coptic Church.
Now we're pretty sure that Alexander was in Alexandria, or at least nearby Alexandria, and the reason is because a fair number of people wrote about his tomb, and a number of Roman emperors visited it, including Julius Caesar, Caracalla, and several others. So we know that the tomb existed for a very, very long time. But we're not sure exactly where it was, whether it was in the church or the mosque or someplace else. Since then, the Department of Antiquities in Egypt has recorded something like 140 specific excavations by archaeologists looking for Alexander's tomb. There are lots of possibilities as to where it is. Alexander's body. Don't forget about it, because we're going to be coming back to it. But Alexander's body isn't the only interesting thing in Alexandria. For example, why is Alexandria where it is? Today, and for most of antiquity, Alexandria was the major seaport on the Mediterranean. For as far as Egypt was concerned, it was their main grain export location. And it did huge business. But before Alexander's time, it wasn't there. There might have been a small fishing village there, but that was about it. Now, why is Alexandria where it is? Because virtually all Egyptian cities are along the Nile. This one is more on the Mediterranean Sea. Alexandria, though, is near the westernmost branch of the Nile Delta. And that's where Alexandria gets its water. Take a look at the map. If you start looking in the far back, you see desert. But along the side, you see the western branch of the Nile, and then this long peninsula that Alexandria is on. That gives it tremendous advantages. It has a saltwater port, but lots of fresh water available, and access to the interior of Egypt. Now, there are disadvantages to this location, one of which is the ground is sinking. In some places, since Alexander's time, it's gone down as much as 12 feet. That's not the only thing that was important. In ancient times, they were very concerned about the rocks and shoals and everything in the area. This is, of course, well before the days of GPS, and so ships went into a certain amount of hazard in order to be able to get to the port of Alexandria. They could run aground. So to solve that problem, the Greeks, which were in control of the city, and it's more a Greek city than an Egyptian city, especially at this time, built a very tall tower on an island. The island is the Pharaoh's Island, and the tall tower becomes a lighthouse, and so the lighthouse is called the Pharaoh's Lighthouse. As a matter of fact, in a lot of languages, Pharaoh's nowadays does mean lighthouse. When I was a child, people would say they had no idea what the lighthouse actually looked like. In fact, that's not entirely true. We have a pretty good idea what it looked like because there were a lot of models made of the lighthouse at Alexandria. A lot of images of it in various places, sometimes on tombs, sometimes on coins. But the most fantastic example of the great lighthouse at Alexandria is a near exact copy, we believe, that was made in Roman times when the lighthouse was completely erect. This lighthouse is still in operation on the North Spanish coast, and you can see it there. And what you see is that there are three basic shapes, one on top of the other. We'll go into those basic shapes shortly. So what happened to the Great Lighthouse? Well, much of it is in the Mediterranean now, partially because of the sinking that I told you about, and partially because there was a number of earthquakes that made it go down over a period of time. Also, part of the lighthouse has been, part of the lighthouse blocks have been used to build a newer fort, an Islamic era fort. And so a number of the lighthouse blocks you can find in the fort and a number on the Mediterranean seafloor. Now, the lighthouse survived into fairly modern times, but every time there was an earthquake or other problems, it kind of got smaller. In ancient times, it looks like this, but by Islamic times, it looks like this, and later on you see a slightly different version. In any event, the lighthouse was here, but it was destroyed not at one time, but over a period of centuries and multiple earthquakes, and of course the land sinking.
Most of the good building material that came down from the lighthouse as it collapsed in a series of earthquakes over the centuries that didn't end up in the Mediterranean, ended up in this castle. This castle is really dates back to the 15th century. The need for a fort at Alexandria is probably a result of the Crusades and the fears that Egypt would succumb to one of them. Across the old bay, you can see a building, and that building has a familiar name. It's the Library of Alexandria. No one really knows what the old library looked like. At least I haven't got a clue as to what it looked like, but I'm reasonably certain it didn't look like this. They did miss a bet, however, in this library. I kind of expected that there would be a room in the library someplace that talked about the old library and what it looked like and what was known about it and how many volumes of material it had and that sort of thing. But there's not even a hint that the old library existed that I could see. As you're leaving Alexandria and going out to the west with the Mediterranean on your right, some distance out of the city, a tower like this appears, and it is in a familiar shape. A square at the base, an octagon in the middle, and circular on top, just like the old lighthouse. And in fact, this is supposed to be, or said to be, a monument, but I find that a little bit hard to believe. From the back, there are actually tombs that have been dug into the rock beneath the monument. I found no indication what it could possibly be a monument to or for, or what the function was, except that it could be a lighthouse, because the Mediterranean is visible from the top of this tower. And we're pretty sure that this is a relatively accurate depiction of the lighthouse, because it was created, possibly by the same people that built the one in Alexandria, only a couple of decades after the Alexandrian one was created.
When Alexander left what was to become Alexandria, he went west on the coastal highway road along the Mediterranean, the same route that we're taking. And along that route today, there is a replica that was built of the lighthouse. The lighthouse, of course, did not exist in Alexander's day, but the Ptolemies erected it. And a few decades after the Ptolemies erected the lighthouse, this monument was erected. Below it, there is a tomb, but we don't know who was ever in the tomb.
I suspect that this was, in fact, an actual operating lighthouse, and furthermore, that there were hundreds of them at one time along this coast that looked almost exactly like this, a copy of the one in Alexandria on smaller scale. Now I'd like to return for the moment to Alexander's tomb and where it is or isn't. The fact is that if you ask any knowledgeable person about this, they'll tell you they haven't the foggiest idea where Alexander's tomb is. But frankly, I suspect that it's still in Alexandria, probably under the Daniel Mosque someplace, or at least very close to it. And the only reason we probably haven't found it is because archaeologists can't get a permit to dig under that mosque. In any event, remember Alexander. We're coming back to him.
When Alexander left what would become Alexandria, he traveled to the west along the Mediterranean coast, and then he turned south into the Sahara Desert. That's the same route that we're taking, and for the same reason. He was headed towards a temple at a place called Siwa. Now in Alexander's time, that's part of Libya. Today, that's part of Egypt. Siwa had a temple to Amun, which was very, very popular, very prestigious in its day. It was like the Delphic oracle. And the temple to Amun, which is the way that the Berbers out in that area pronounced it instead of Amun, which is the way the Egyptians pronounced it, they were expecting Alexander. Alexander got lost in a sandstorm, but he found his way out and made it to the temple. Well, when he did, he was greeted by the temple priest, who spoke a little bit of Greek, but apparently not very well. You see, the priest intended to welcome Alexander on behalf of the god, but instead, he welcomed Alexander as a god. Well, that impressed Alexander considerably because he could add it to his reasons for why he was Pharaoh of Egypt. Because the pharaohs were always considered to be gods. Now, he spent some time at Amun and then he left. There is one other thing about Amun that I want to mention. And that is, it is also the source for the word ammonia. You see, crystals of Amun, which are used to make ammonia, were first discovered at this temple. Oh, and I told you we were coming back to Alexander's tomb. For a very long time, it's been assumed that his tomb might be at Siwa. The reason for that is because in Roman times, there was a Roman by the name of Quintus Curtius Rufius. And Quintus says that Alexander, on his deathbed in Babylon, expressed a desire to be buried at Siwa. Since then, about a decade ago, there was an archaeologist that claimed to have found his tomb here at Siwa, but other archaeologists have disagreed. The local tourism promoters last year in 21, they also said that his tomb was located here at Siwa, but that's not very well accepted either. In any event, Alexander may be at Siwa. Come to think of it, it's very likely that Cleopatra is buried someplace near Alexander. And for that matter, do you know that we don't know the location of any of the Ptolemy's tombs? They're probably all in the same location, which might be Siwa.
So if crystals of Amun were discovered here, how and when were they discovered? I've heard several explanations, one of which is that the crystals were discovered at the temple in the chimneys, or in another case it was in camel's dung. But I talked to an archaeologist, and this is where the crystals of Amun come from. It's the Salt Lake. At about 4 feet under the surface, some of the crystals are actually ammonia crystals and not so much salt crystals. The crystals were originally used to reduce the smoke from lamps. We're going up to the top of a hill where the old city of Shali was built. It was built in the 13th century. But in the 1930s, it suffered from a series of very heavy rains, and being mud brick, well, it didn't survive. Now, you've probably already noticed something that's a little bit odd. Chalets in Siwa, and Siwa is a very large oasis. But there's something that you probably didn't expect to see out in the desert, even at an oasis, at least not at the scale that you're seeing it now. When you take a look at a desert oasis, what you expect to see is something more like this. But that's not the case with Siwa. Siwa is large, very large, and it has a great deal of groundwater. And the result is there are 300,000 trees at Siwa. Oh, and incidentally, this is a photograph from Chalet of the Oracle Temple in the distance. Also from Chalet, you can see the local cemetery, the Mountain of the Dead. The people that are buried at the top of the mountain tend to be wealthy or more prominent. This is the high rent district intended to keep the hoi polloi out.
We're at Siwa, this time at the Mountain of the Dead. And that's the mountain behind me. And usually the people that are most wealthy, that have the most amount of fame, are going to be buried near the top. Now, one of the reasons that we're here is because there is a story that Alexander the Great wanted to be buried at Siwa. Now, we know that, in fact, he was buried at Alexandria, but then his body disappeared. And it is possible that he was reburied here at Siwa somewhere. Now, two archaeologists have indicated that they thought they found Alexander the Great's tomb here at Siwa. Both of them have been proven wrong.
Now it's time for us to go out into the real desert, the sand dunes. When you're out in this desert, you might run across things that you might not expect. After all, it was under the ocean at one time, and there is evidence of that.
Today, the Sahara Desert looks much more like this, but even so, there are some surprises every once in a while. There are several fairly large lakes out here. And this is Egypt's only real waterfall. What we have is a series of lakes that are interconnected, and the channel in between them has this waterfall on it. I asked what the source of the water for the first lake happened to be, and I was told it was agricultural runoff. But I don't believe that could possibly be true, at least not to account for all of the water. There must be an artesian spring, probably under the first lake at least.
Today, Wadi al-Itan, or Valley of the Whales, lies to the west of the eternal Nile River, 170 kilometers southwest of Cairo, bordering the oasis of Fayoum.
We're at the Wadi Hatan, which means the Valley of the Whales. We're out in the Sahara Desert, and we're going to be doing whale watching out here. The whales out here aren't moving a whole lot, so photography is going to be a little bit easier than it might normally be. These whales have been here a very, very long time. And we're going to be looking at Basilosaurus for one, an ancient whale. It means, the name, king lizard in Greek, but he's not a lizard. He is in fact probably the largest, that is longest, vertebrate animal that ever roamed the planet. He's almost snake-like though, so he's not very heavy. But he's actually a cetacean. That is, he's a whale, a type of whale. Whales go back to the beginning of the time immediately after the dinosaurs, when India was crashing into Asia. And they found a number of very interesting fossils in that area between the two, where the sea was getting more and more shallow. The Tethys Sea, they call it. The first animal is a Pachycetus. A Pachycetus is a cetus in the sense that means whale. In Greek it would be pronounced katos. But in Latinized versions, it's usually pronounced cetus. The C being soft, which is the way that the French pronounced the Latin C in medieval times. In any event, Pachycetus doesn't look at all like a whale. He looks very much like a deer. And from that, he starts changing into Ambulocetus, the walking, ambuli meaning the walking, and cetus meaning the whale. Pachycetus was a reference to the fact that it was found in what might be Pakistan today. Ambulocetus looks much more like an otter or maybe a seal. It's fairly small. Ambulocetus and Pachycetus are both clearly whales, and you can tell that if for no other reason than because of the inner ear. All of the cetaceans have a peculiar type of inner ear, which it turns out helps them a great deal underwater. After Pachycetus, there's Kutchicetus, also a reference to this particular area, the geographic area. And after that, there's an animal called Dorudon. Now, Dorudon is probably the ancestor of all modern whales. Dorudon, the don refers to tooth, and the duro says spear-shaped. It had spear-shaped teeth. In fact, its teeth weren't homogeneous. They were like your teeth. That is, you could identify a molar, an incisor, a canine, things like that. Something you can't do with modern whales at all. Dorudon wasn't discovered first in India or Pakistan. It was discovered first here in the Wadi al-Hatan, the Valley of the Whales. There's also Basilosaurus, which looks very much like a Dorudon, except that it's much, much bigger. About 3 times the size of the Dorudon. And we found Dorudon calves that have the markings of Basilosaurus teeth on them. So we're fairly certain the Basilosaurus were in fact hunting the Dorudons in this valley.
This is a hungry mother. Over the course of the next few days, the Basilosaurus returns time after time. The lagoon is transformed from a sanctuary into a bloodbath. This is what it means to be top of the food chain. It has taken the death of several Dorudon calves to further the survival of the unborn Basilosaurus.
The Wadi may have looked much more like this in its heyday, a tight fit for a large whale, but not so bad for a smaller whale.
Wadi al-Hatan is unique for the number and concentration of its fossils, which have helped answer important questions about the evolution of life on Earth. A total of 379 whale fossils have been found, comprising 3 different species dating back 40 million years. These are the best fossilized remains of whales found anywhere in the world. They range from young to old, and many have been found in death positions. And even today, new discoveries are being made.
In fact, here in Wadi al-Hatan, they found a new whale of a very old design that still had all 4 limbs. This was discovered in 2021. When I went to the museum at the Wadi, I discovered a BBC crew working on films. The reality is that I often discover professional film crews on my travel. In this case, they're filming 2 of the museum's Basilosaurus. Now, in Greek, Basilosaurus means king lizard, and in fact they were originally thought to be reptiles. The animals are very snake-like, and the head looks an awful lot like a crocodile head. But they are whales. Outside of the museum, there's an extensive walking trail through the valley in which you can see the fossils in situ. And I followed the BBC film crew out into the valley. These are their film trucks. And in fact, the Basilosaurus can get to be about 60 feet long or so. They are in fact the longest mammal that ever lived on the planet. There is clear evidence that in the beginning this was a saltwater marsh, a mangrove marsh, and these are the roots. Now these next, these are yardang, and they're wind sculpted, and they look at the distance as though they might be animals lying down sometimes. Now you might think that these police are part of a routine patrol, but they're not. They are in fact part of my personal bodyguard. When I go into dangerous areas in Egypt, I take not only a driver and an Egyptologist with me, but also a security man armed with a pistol in the vehicle that I'm in, and often a police car in front and one in back with 6 or 8 policemen in it, and that's the case here. Next we go to the Beni Hassan tombs, and there I find another professional film crew. Now this one is an independent organization, not like BBC. The folks that were doing the work were mostly British, in fact I think maybe entirely British, but the company that was backing them, or at least one of them, was a Lebanese company. These paintings on the walls are clearly worth videotaping. And here's a kind of scene I've never seen before in an Egyptian tomb or temple. It's guys wrestling, and it's a very extensive depiction of that, various wrestling moves and everything. They're all quite different. When Pharaoh Akhenaten and Nefertiti, his wife, established a new religion dedicated to the Atan, they moved the capital from the old site of Luxor to Amarna. And when they did that, they selected Amarna because it was a virgin site. It was a virgin site because there wasn't any particularly good water source there, and that turns out to have been a big problem for him. Nevertheless, he built a city here. The religion and the new capital only lasted as long as Akhenaten lived. Then it moved back to Luxor,
and the old religion returned. Akhenaten was likely buried at a tomb near here, but when the court moved back to Luxor, that is what was called Thebes at the time, his body was probably disinterred and moved to the Valley of the Kings, although that's unclear. To get to his tomb, you first go down a flight of 20 stairs to the main entrance. We asked the keeper of the tomb why he banged on the door before he opened it, and he replied he wanted to wake up the spirits to make sure that they understood they were going to be getting guests. On the right-hand side, there are some unfinished rooms halfway down the corridor. At the bottom of the flight of stairs, there's a bridge over a deep pit. I assume that was intended for tomb robbers. And this is where the sarcophagus ought to be. There is still some decoration on the walls, although much of the walls are simply unfinished. This happens to be the army and the chariot corps. And this is the classic scene of Akhenaten and Nefertiti and the Atan. The figures here have been badly damaged, probably in antiquity, by Egyptians that were unhappy with the rain. After it was over, they did this, probably. Remember Akhenaten and Nefertiti because we're coming back to them. We're back in Sahara, and in the distance there you can see the Bent Pyramid. But in front of the Bent Pyramid there's another pyramid, and that pyramid is the pyramid of Pepi II, who lived around 2250 BC, that is about 4,300 years ago. According to tradition, Pepi lived for something over 100 years, and he ruled for 96 of them, having come to the throne when he was about 6 years old. That makes him the oldest living, the oldest reigning monarch of all time, if that tradition is true. Now, Pepi was one of the last of the Old Kingdom rulers, and there are, of this period, many surviving inscriptions talking about trading expeditions to the south. One of the most interesting concerns, a nomarch named Harkuf. Now, a nomarch is someone who is in charge of a nome, and a nome is like a province or a state in Egypt. And nome number 1, which is the one that he was in charge of, is the one that's furthest south on the Nile. Now, Harkuf had made many journeys into Nubia, that is what we would call Sudan today, and on one occasion he wrote back to the 9-year-old Pepi II, describing a dancing dwarf that he was bringing back to Egypt. The excitement of the little king is conspicuous in the letter that he wrote back to Harkuf, and it's possible to see in his words the young fellow unable to contain himself and forgetting his royal dignity. So we're going down to Aswan, which is where the first nome was, and we're going to visit the tomb of Harkuf. Harkuf's tomb, like the tombs of many of the nobles of this area, is on that mountain over there. Now this is the text that Pepi II writes back to Harkuf. He says, "You have said in your letter that you have come down in safety from Yam," that is Sudan, with the army, and brought many beautiful gifts which Hathor, that it's a goddess, the lady of Yamu, has given to the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, that is, to Pepi. You also say in this letter that you have brought a dwarf, it could have been a pygmy, of divine dances from the land of the horizon dwellers, like the dwarf whom the treasurer of the god Borded brought from Punt, that is probably Ethiopia, at the time of King Iesi. You say to my majesty, never before has one like him been brought by any other who has visited Yam. King Pepi goes on to write to Harkuf, "Each year you do what your lord desires, spending day and night with the caravan. Now come northward at once to the court. You must bring the dwarf alive, sound and well, to rejoice and gladden the heart of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. You say to my majesty, never before has one like him been brought by any other who has visited Yam. When he comes down with you into the ship, appoint reliable people who shall be beside him on each side of the vessel, and take care lest he should fall into the water. When he sleeps at night, appoint trustworthy people who shall sleep beside him. Inspect him 10 times a night, because my majesty desires to see this dwarf more than all the products of Sinai and Punt." Punt is probably Ethiopia. Pepi was extremely excited. Pepi concludes his letter by saying, "If you arrive at the court and the dwarf is with you, alive and well, my majesty will make you many excellent honors, to be an ornament for the son of your son forever. All the people will say when they hear what my majesty does for you, 'Is there anything like this, which was done for the privy councillor Harkuf when he came down from Yam?'" This is the hieroglyphic of the dwarf, taken from the front of Harkuf's tomb.
When he ruled again, he was young boy, Pepi, yeah? Almost 6 years. That's why he is at Harikhof. He want to bring for him that dwarf as a kind of clown, play with him, and he's still in.
Aswan, where Harkuf's tomb is located, and where the first nome was, is at the first cataract of the Nile. Now, the first cataract is the first falls or rapids that you come to as you travel south on the Nile. And it is the traditional end of Egyptian territory proper. And furthermore, it is also the gateway to points further south, like Abu Simbel, which is where we're going next.
fantastic.
I think they're frightening.
No, they're not.
Do you think he'll sing a note for me?
Why not? You're divine.
Welcome to the Temple of Abu Simbel. The facade is 84 feet long. Each of the statues of Ramesses II is 65 feet high.
This is the main temple, the temple to Ramses at Abu Simbel. There is also a lesser temple to his wife, Nefertari, at the same location. As you can see, there are thousands of people here, and there are actually hundreds of police and army as well, and the governor of the province has showed up for this occasion. The temples are not at their original location due to the rising waters of Lake Nasser caused by the Aswan Dam. In the 1960s, they had to be moved to higher ground. This meant taking them apart block by block and rebuilding them correctly. That was a massive project of the 1960s. The reconstruction was so accurate that the light of dawn still reaches all the way down the hallway and illuminates 3 out of 4 statues. The one that it doesn't illuminate is Ptah, and the one in the middle is Ramses. But that only happens in February and October. Now these dates happen to coincide with traditional dates for Ramses' birthday and for his coronation date. However, we really don't have the foggiest idea what those dates really were, so we haven't the foggiest idea whether or not those dates happen to be accurate. Nevertheless, everyone here is eagerly waiting for dawn. Anticipating the crowd, I took this video the day before the main event so that we could see what the hall looks like with fewer people in it. The statues to be illuminated are behind that group of people sitting on the floor in the far back. This next scene is of the day of the celebration. In order to get near the front of the line on the day of the celebration, I had to wake up at 1 o'clock in the morning in order to get in line. And you can see that now the light is streaming down the hall, and it is illuminating the statues. So let's go take a look at them. Well, in case you missed them, this is the photograph that I took the day before, when there weren't so many people and so much hurry to move everyone along. Ptah is on your left, and he stays in the dark. Ramesses is in the middle of the other three gods, which are illuminated. Now the problem is to get out of the madhouse. Oh, by the way, the shadow on the wall is my camera on my tripod, which I held above everybody's head in order to get a relatively clear shot of the statues at dawn. Meanwhile, let's take a look at the walls of the temple, because the drawings and hieroglyphics that are on them actually tell us quite a bit about what was going on. It's, of course, Egyptian propaganda, though. In the first scene that I'm showing you, Ramesses is quite large, and notice that his subjects are all quite small. Here we're not talking about the physical size as much as we are the spiritual size of the individuals. But when Ramesses is depicted with the gods, he's the same size that they are, and of course the reason for that is because he is also himself a god. Here, Ramesses is presenting lotus flowers to a goddess. Lotus flowers usually indicates love. And behind him is his wife, Nefertari. She also has a lotus flower, and that other thing in her hand is a sistra, a musical instrument that she's playing. Notice that she is about the same size as Ramesses, and the reason for that is because she herself is a goddess. That is not usual. Here again, Nefertari, Ramesses, and the gods are all the same size, and Nefertari is still playing the sistra. And in this next one, she is once again the same size as the gods, but she is without Ramesses, but she has two sistra in her hands. And it's the same thing when you go outside the temple of Nefertari. What you see is Nefertari is roughly the same size as Ramesses. Now this is the classic smiting scene where the pharaoh is defeating all of his enemies. He has them by the hair and he's going to hit them with a battle mace. This is depicting Ramesses carting off prisoners of war. And this particular drawing, this particular artwork, is on the southern side of the temple, the side of the temple that faces Numidia, that is what is today Sudan. And so the prisoners that he's got are Numidians, that is, they are African. And you can tell that by looking at the faces, although they're a little bit distorted here. These next depictions are from the north side of the wall, and there they show the pharaoh defeating people that appear to be Middle Eastern. One of the ways that you can tell they're Middle Eastern is because they tend to have beards. Now, these men are prisoners of war from the Middle East. They may be Hittites, but it's hard to tell. The Pharaoh's army, of course, is always an important part of the depictions because they play basically supporting roles. The Pharaoh is always portrayed as being heroic, but he does have the army with him. Now, this wall has something very specific on it. It refers to the Battle of Kadesh. You see those circles that are on the wall. Those are the city walls, and inside are the buildings of Kadesh. And outside those circles, you see all kinds of soldiers and chariots and people dying and fighting and such. It's a little bit difficult to see, so I'm going to try to get you a better view of it through a drawing. This is a sketch of what is basically on the wall. It's a very complicated story, a very detailed story about the Battle of Kadesh, which Ramesses claims he won, but that's somewhat in doubt because we also have the Hittite records as well, and both sides claim victory in this particular battle. This is the first one in which we have detailed evidence from both sides.
Now we have a little bit of a problem. You see, I want to talk with you about the Battle of Kadesh. It's the world's most famous early battle. It's the first battle in which we have detailed information about precisely what happened from both sides, including a certain amount of the logistics. But I can't really explain Kadesh unless I explain a couple of hundred years of Egyptian history. The earliest Egyptian history that most people know about is the Old Kingdom. And it's in the Old Kingdom where the great pyramids were being built and where Khufu was building his pyramid and all that sort of thing. Incidentally, this is the hieroglyphic for Khufu. And that is Egypt's strongest point for a while. After that, it declines, it becomes weak. And as it becomes weak, some people from the Middle East, from the Tigris-Euphrates area, the Levant, come down into Egypt and they conquer half of Egypt, the northern half, of course, of Egypt. And those people, the Egyptians called the Hyksos. Well, it was a century or so, a couple of centuries, before the Egyptians were able to throw the Hyksos out of Egypt. Now, how did the Hyksos defeat the Egyptians to begin with? Well, the way they defeated the Egyptians was with chariots. The Egyptians believed in infantry. Chariots, for all practical purposes, are sort of the ancient version of tanks, and the Egyptians were not capable of standing up to them. The Hittite chariots were very heavy. They usually had 3 people on board, a driver, a weapons officer, and a shield bearer. So there's usually 3 people on a Hittite chariot. Egypt, once it had lost the northern half of Egypt, Egypt had to come up with its own chariots, which it did. They were lighter, faster, more mobile, more agile, but they only carried 2 people on them. There would be the driver and the weapons officer. Incidentally, the pharaoh had the ability to drive the chariot and to fight at the same time as this illustration depicts. In any event, the Egyptians caught up with the people in the Mideast on chariot technology. But the Egyptians never forgot the Hyksos. The first pharaohs to throw the Hyksos out usually have names that end in Mos. Ahmose is the first one. But maybe the most famous one is Tutmosis III. He pushed the Egyptian boundaries about as far up north as they had ever been. He conquered pretty much the entire eastern part of the Mediterranean coast. And that secured Egypt from having the danger of being invaded again for the most part. And it wasn't just Tutmosis III, it was Egyptian policy for hundreds of years. In fact, it was Egyptian policy to keep an army up there and keep vassal states in place. Well, eventually a group called the Mitanni take advantage of the Egyptian weakness. And the Mitanni and the Egyptians eventually have some conflict. Now, while this is going on, the Mitanni have their own problems. They're being squeezed on one side by the Assyrians and on the other side by the Hittites. The Egyptian policy towards the Mitanni is quite friendly after they have some peace treaties, and Mitanni princesses come down into Egypt to marry the Egyptian pharaoh. Remember that because it becomes a staple of Egyptian policy, marriage alliances. In any event, the Mitanni are squeezed out by its difficult neighbors. And eventually what happens is that you find conflict between the Hatti, that is the Hittites, and the Egyptians over vassal states in what would now be Lebanon, basically, and Syria. Now we get to Pharaoh Akhenaten. He was the pharaoh that believed in something that looked a little bit like monotheism, and he called all of his soldiers back to go into Egypt and to clear out the remnants of the old religion to the extent that they could. The result of that was a power vacuum in the Middle East. Imagine Syria was in confusion, conflict, and chaos. During Akhenaten's time, the diplomacy was done by Akhenaten's mother, Tuya, and she didn't have an army to send up north. Eventually, the Egyptians come back after the time of Akhenaten. This is the time of King Tut. And a little bit after his time, there are a number of armies that go back up into the north to try to restore order. Next, we're going up to Hattusha to review some of the Hittite archives. This is the royal palace at Hattusha. This is where the state archives were kept. And they were found here, in clay tablets about 100 years ago. A lot of the clay tablets tell us a great deal about what was going on. The Hittites had good relations with the Egyptians most of the time. And this happens to be a story about a messenger that came up from Egypt. And the messenger is from the Queen of Egypt. And the message is, "My husband is dead, and I have no son. people say that you have many sons, and that your sons are adult. If you send me one of your sons, he will become my husband, for it is repugnant to me to take one of my servants to my husband." Now, when the Hittite king learned this, he was a little bit concerned, and he gathered together his council, and he said, "Since the most ancient times, such a thing has never happened before." So he sent one of his people down to Egypt, and he told him, "Go bring me information worthy of belief. They may try to deceive me, and as to the possibility that they may have a prince, bring me back information worthy of belief." Well, a little while later, the messenger comes back from Egypt, and he says, the king says, "Perhaps they have a prince. They may be trying to deceive me and do not really want one of my sons to reign over them." But the Egyptian queen answered, and she said, "Why do you say they are trying to deceive me? If I had a son, should I write to a foreign country in a manner humiliating to me and my country? You do not believe me, and you even say so to me. He who was my husband is dead. I have no son. Should I then perhaps take one of my servants and make of him my husband? I have written to no other country. I have written only to you. They say that you have many sons. Give me one of your sons, and he will be my husband, and lord of the land of Egypt." So which Egyptian queen was this? Well, based on the time when the letters were written, it could very well be the wife of King Tut. King Tut died early, you recall. And the queen was very young. Now, King Tut was followed by the high priest, Ai. Ai was an old man, and the queen surely did not want to marry him. In fact, as soon as they were married, she disappears from history. No one knows what happened to her. Oh, and as far as the Hittite prince is concerned, he made it to the border of Egypt, and then he disappears too. There are lots of good stories in the Hittite texts. Because it's King Tut, he's followed by Ai, who was the old Grand Vizier. He's followed by Horemheb, and Horemheb is followed by Ramesses the First. This is not Ramesses the Great, it's his grandfather. And then Seti follows Ramesses, that's Ramesses the Great's father. Now when Ramesses II comes into power, he has to prove himself. The Ramesses, his grandfather and his father, were from a line of Egyptian generals. And so they really don't have the degree of legitimacy yet that they would like. Ramesses, in order to prove that he's worthy, takes the army up north several times and attacks into the Hittites, who are attacking the Egyptians. And so there's this conflict going on. That brings us to the battle that I want to talk about, Kadesh. Ramesses forms up 4 divisions: the Set division, the Ptah division, the Amun division, and the Ra division. Each one of these is named after Egyptian gods. And they head up north with the Amun division in the lead. And Ramesses is with the Amun division. And they run across some Bedouin. Now these Bedouin happen to be in the pay of the Hattusians, the Hittites. And they tell Ramesses that the Hittite king is afraid of Ramesses and has his army 100 miles away, 150 miles away actually. Ramesses believes that, and he establishes a camp across the river from Kadesh.
These are the 2 Bedouin that misled Ramesses. You can find their images on the walls at Abu Simbel.
Now, at that point, they pick up a couple of reconnaissance troops sent by the Hittite king. And they torture them, which is the way that interrogation normally occurs in ancient times. And the Hittite troops confess that the Hittite king is just behind Kadesh, waiting to attack. So there's an emergency council meeting and they start preparing for the attack. But his army is still in march. He's only got one division on location and another division coming up, and it's strung out. And the Hittites form a strike force of chariots. They have about 2,500 chariots in their army. Ramesses has about 2,000, but they're lighter and more agile. So it'll be a contest to see which ones work out best. The armies themselves, well, Ramesses had about 20,000 troops, and the Hittites have nearly double that, 39,000. So the chariotry of the Hittite army breaks out of the woods, crosses the river, and attacks the Ra division, which is in progress headed up towards Kadesh. The shock effect of the Hittite chariotry disperses the Ra division. It's completely shattered at this point. And then they move up, the chariotry, the Hittite chariotry moves up to the camp where the Amun division is located. And the Amun division is crippled very, very badly. At this point, the Hittites lose control of their people. The Hittite charioteers dismount their chariots and they begin to start looting the Egyptian camp. This gives Ramesses an opportunity to take his personal bodyguard and attack the Hittites, which they do quite successfully. In addition to that, there's a group unknown to the Hittites that appear in support of the Egyptian army. The Nirain are probably Moabites, but in any event they come from one of the vassal states that the Egyptians have, and they descend on the Hittite chariotry, and it is badly crippled. The Ptah and Set divisions are still on the road trying to get up to the battlefield. What happened to the main body of the Hittite troops, the 39,000 that I talked to you about? They're still in place with the Hittite king. They never move into the battle. The Hittite chariotry had the opportunity to kill Ramesses and secure the victory, but instead they fell to looting the camp. Well, at this point, neither one of them has won a clear victory. The Egyptians say that they won because they held the field after the battle was over. But then on the other hand, the Hittites still hold Kadesh. Now at this point, there are several different campaigns that occur, continuous fighting between the Hittites and Ramesses. And the result of that is bad for both sides. It's draining both countries. And the Hittite queen, her name is Pudahepa, writes to the Egyptian queen, Nefertari. Now, Nefertari sounds a little bit like Nefertiti, but it's a different person. Nefer means beautiful, so a lot of Egyptian women have Nefer in their names. Nefertari and Pudahepa are writing back and forth, and what they're talking about is setting up a peace treaty. And it's the first peace treaty of which we have evidence from both sides and in roughly full text. As a matter of fact, the Egyptians put the peace treaty all over everything that they've got. And the Hittites make several copies as well, and we have copies of both of them. They don't tell exactly the same story. The Hittites say that they won, and the Egyptians say that they won the Battle of Kadesh. Nevertheless, the terms of the peace treaty are pretty similar.
In 1258 BCE, the Treaty of Kadesh was signed and included terms such as if a person of importance were to seek refuge in the other's territory, they had to be returned. The Treaty of Kadesh initiated a period of open trade relations between Egypt and the Hittites until the fall of the Hittite Empire in around 1200 BCE.
You remember what I said about the Mitanni? How the Egyptians solidified their peace treaty with marriage exchanges, and there were a bunch of Mitanni princesses that came down and married the Egyptian king. Well, the same thing happens with the Hittites. The first princess that came down to marry Ramesses from Hittite land, we have 6 copies of the wedding announcement. And the second princess that he marries, well, we have a couple of copies of that announcement. So it's Egyptian policy to solidify the peace treaty with a marriage alliance.
This is the wedding announcement at Abu Simbel. It's right in front of the main temple, the Ramesses temple. And at the top of it, you see Ramesses. He's a little hard to make out due to weathering. To your right now, you see the bride. This is the daughter of Ptah. And the father of the bride is behind her. He is the king of the Hittites. And you can tell that because of the hat that he's wearing. This next photo actually comes from Hattusha, but it's the Hittite army, and notice the hats are very similar to the one that was worn by the king on the marriage stela. Incidentally, Ptah is probably one of the world's most powerful women that was ever in government. She was in charge of religion at Hattusha. It also did substantial foreign policy, and she decided judicial litigation. This is a letter to Ptah in cuneiform, which is the language of foreign diplomacy. We have 15 letters from the Egyptians received by Ptah at Hattusha. One, at least, was from Nefertari, and one was from Ramses' mother. She was, for all practical purposes, the Iron Lady of the Bronze Age.